One and two, and 1, 2, 3, let's go.
Human trafficking, known as a modern-day slavery that's happening everywhere. Human trafficking, also known as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of persons by means of the trade or use of force or other forms of coercions, of abductions, of fraud, of deceptions, of the abuse of power or of positions of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefit to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitations. Exploitation shall include at a minimum the exploitation of the prostitutions of other forms of sexual exploitations, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. There are several types of cases involved in human trafficking. The first one is forced labor exploitations. It covers 67.9% and involves a total of 40.2 million people in the world, which also consists of men, women, and children. Secondly, it is forced sexual exploitation, which includes more than 4.5 million people, which is 21.5%, and most of them are women and children. Thirdly, state-imposed forced labor, over 2.2 million people that involved in the cases, which mean over 10.5% of them, main forms of exploitations and profile to detect victims by sub-regions in 2016 or most recent. Based on this data, in South Asia, the average persons that involved in this activity is women, men, and children. Most of them are involved in activities, sex exploitations, and forced labor. In the United States, most of them are women enslaved to sex slave. This shows that most cases of human trafficking in US occur on women. However, in Africa, it is very different, where women and men are involved in cases of sexual exploitations, forced labor, and even beggars. This statistic represents the total number of human trafficking victims identified worldwide from 2008 to 2019. In 2019, more than 100,000 victims of human trafficking were identified worldwide. Despite increased international attentions and resources from the states and other non-governmental institutions, the number of people falling victims to human trafficking around the world continues to grow. Between 2008 and 2009, the number of human trafficking victims identified worldwide more than tripled from 30,961 to more than 100,000. Though such statistics also lead to a degree of optimism among investigators and human rights advocates, as it suggests that additional focus has led to a greater exposure of the issue. After all, trafficking in persons is an illegal practice shaded in secrecy, and it is therefore near impossible to measure it in its entirety. The two primary forms of exploitation people are trafficked for forced labor and sexual exploitations, with regional variances of the proportions of each. Although sexual exploitation remains the primary form, the prevalence of forced labor as the criminal motivations has grown in the last decades. The part explains the rising share of male victims on human trafficking, according to United Nations. The analysis suggests that the vast majority of male traffic victims are trafficked for the purpose of forced labor, some 66.1% in 2016. For women, Traditional understandings of human trafficking remains the norms with 77.5% of male victims. There are several ways criminals commit human trafficking cases, include manipulated them or forced against their wills to engage in sex acts for money. Otherwise, sex trafficking might use violence, threat, manipulations, or the promise of love and affections to lure victims. Although truck stops, hotel rooms, rest areas, street corners, clubs, and private residences are just places where victims are forced to sell sex. The profits that they get from these activities. For sexual exploitations, more than 99 billion US dollars represents 66% of the total human trafficking, means their highest amount of profit. Their seconds as the exploitations of forced labor. Criminal will earn more than 28.7% with 43.2 billion US dollars, showing the second largest profit they can make. Last but not least is domestic servitude. Over than $8 million represents 5.3% from the profits. That is a very large amount of us. What are the effects of human trafficking? Human trafficking can have physical, emotional, and psychological effects on anyone involved. It has the power to impact someone's life forever. Here are some common ways human trafficking affects victims and perpetrators. As you read through these sections, keep in mind that many traffickers also experience trauma because of what they see and do to others, and many traffickers have been victimized themselves at some points in their life. Mental trauma. The U.S. Department of State explains because traffickers dehumanize and objectify their victims' innate sense of power, visibility, and dignity often become obscured. Victims of human trafficking can experience devastating psychological effects during and after their trafficking experience. Many survivors may end up experiencing post-traumatic stress, difficult end relationships, depressions, memory loss, anxieties, fear, guilty, shames, and other severe forms of mental trauma. Physical trauma. Many victims also experience physical injuries. Those who have been sexually exploited are often abused by their traffickers or customers. They may be raped, beaten, and subject to abuse over a long period of time. There is also higher risk of contracting sexually transmitted disease, infections, diabetes, cancer, and other illness. A lack of proper medical care allows these conditions to spread and worsen, often affecting an individual's health permanently. Victims of forced labor may work in dangerous conditions for long hours, doing repetitive tasks. They may also be exposed to dangerous contaminants or work with heavy equipment. As a result, many are subject to serious infections, respiratory problems, injuries, impairments, and exhaustions. Lastly, the lack of independent living skills. Many victims who escape trafficking situations lack advanced education and the resources needed to live independently. They may not understand law in the country where they are now reside, or may not speak the language. They may have been trafficked at a young age and were unable to attend school or go to college. Having been locked in the same job for a long time and not allowed to learn new skills, they may have difficulty living in their own.